Welcome, everybody. I'm Josh Mills, the chair of the journalism department at Baruch College, and we're delighted to take up this important topic today. I'm going to just very quickly introduce our panelists. John Alsup writes the media, excuse me, the Media Today column for the Columbia Journalism Review. Eric Deggans is the television critic at NPR and the author of Race Baiter, How the Media Wields Dangerous. Sorry, what do you put? Okay. Dangerous Words to Divide a Nation. Soledad O'Brien hosts and produces Matter of Fact with Soledad O'Brien, a nationally syndicated television show. And our moderator is my old friend, Betty Wong, who retired as the global managing editor of Reuters, which I believe is still the largest news organization in the world. So thank you all for joining us, and all questions will be directed through chat. And Betty, take it away.
Great, thank you, Josh, and welcome everyone. So as you know, the discussion today is what did the news media get right, wrong, and miss? I have a few questions, and then we're very happy to open up to your questions as well. So to kick it off, Donald Trump was the first Twitter president and used it as his personal news service to bypass the traditional media to speak directly with the public. Did the press ever find an effective response to Trump's Twitter blast during the campaign and transition, or did his disruptive agenda setting dominate the coverage? I'm actually going to throw this first to Soledad, if you don't mind, since I saw that in a recent Fast Company interview, you were quoted as saying, "I'm obsessed with Twitter, even as I call it a cesspool." So what do you think, Soledad?
I am obsessed with Twitter, even as I consider it and call it a cesspool. And the answer is that, yeah, I think Donald Trump did a very good job of constantly derailing reporters off whatever they were planning. And many of my friends who were doing day-to-day coverage would complain about it. You know, we had this story we were about to do, but then Donald Trump tweeted, and that would send the entire newsroom into chaos in many cases. Eventually, they got used to that constant chaos, but it meant they would chase a different story, a different avenue, and something that they might have been working on for days or weeks would go by the wayside so they could chase after this new agenda that had been set by the president's tweets. And the thing that I thought was so disappointing about that is that the media never actually figured out, with some notable exceptions, never really figured out how to stop being Charlie Brown to the Lucy and the football, right? Like it happened over and over and over again. And even when people would occasionally pen, reflective columns on we're chasing the caravan, and oh boy, isn't that interesting how that entire conversation disappeared after the midterms? Even when that would happen, that self-reflection would be lost the next go around. And so I think what the former president did was to wield very intelligently and thoughtfully the main way that he liked to communicate. He knew it was a win for him, and it was a really brilliant strategy. And journalists sucked at, frankly, figuring out how to deal with it. They've never been able to manage it and deal with it. And it was at a tremendous loss, I think, to our viewing and reading public, because a lot of what the president tweeted, sometimes they would just quote tweet, meaning capture it and re-elevate it. And sometimes they would change their entire structure of their newscast. And all of those things, public in doing that. So I don't front.
So if I could jump in, Soledad knows I love her to death, but I'm gonna disagree a little bit in what was said. In that, first, I would say that when the president says something, even on Twitter or social media, it is news, and that is the hardest thing that journalists face in dealing with Trump. Is that he was willing to say things that no other chief executive was willing to say in social media and in writing, particularly all the lies. And even in trying to decode his lies and explain why they're lies and provide the truth of a situation, you wind up elevating his message. What I find so interesting is that the level of disinformation has dropped because Twitter deactivated his accounts. And I think a lot of the responsibility, well, not a lot, I'd say a good amount of the responsibility for policing Trump actually resided with the social media platforms that allowed him to continually violate their terms of service. And they didn't kick him off the platform until he was almost out of office. No other user who wasn't the president would not have been allowed to lie and put that much disinformation on those social media platforms the way he did. So in part, I think it wasn't even journalists' job to shut him down. It was Twitter's job to shut him down, and Facebook's job to shut him down, and Instagram's job to shut him down, just like it's their job to shut anybody down who violates their terms of service. And the final thing that sort of strikes me about Trump and how he used social media is that we're in this. He also had the benefit of having this entire alternative media structure set up to elevate his comments. So even if the Associated Press and NPR and CBS ignored what he put on Twitter, Fox News and Breitbart and Newsmax and One American News Network would run with it and would tell their viewers that whatever he said was true, regardless of whether it actually was true. And I think that's something else that a lot of journalists have not quite gotten their hands around, that there are a lot of media outlets that are considered news outlets that are working in concert with conservative voices and will elevate what they say, even when there's serious problems in their message.
But those news organizations, and back at you with the love for a long time, but those news organizations didn't ignore it, right? I mean, we don't even have an example of where we can say, look, when they decided to ignore it over a period of 6 weeks, we can see where blah, blah, blah. It never happened. And those news organizations also didn't particularly want to ignore it. And I think we have to reassess, certainly historically, when a president says something publicly, historically it always has been, it's de facto news. The president has said something. Different circumstances, different situation, and a president who was more than willing to lie. There is a problem if you are tracking literally tens of thousands of lies and tracking them, but also at the same time elevating them. You are literally not doing the thing you're supposed to do as a journalist. You are giving a platform to misinformation and disinformation. When you are carrying press conferences where there is erroneous information and you're misleading the American public, and it's very clear to everyone or most people, I think you have to reconsider what you're doing and go back to the mission of journalism, because even if he is the president, this was an unusual circumstance, and elevating lies is problematic.
I do think that happened. I do think that CNN, for example, began to run chyrons where they were constantly informing their viewers, this is a lie, this is not true. Again, good news outlets that were operating in good faith stopped carrying those pandemic news conferences live because they realized they were just a campaign. They were just turning into campaign appearances. But it takes some time for that to happen, because you can't just assume that because the president lied the last time, he's going to be lying this time. So it was a process of
that
news
process,
outlets trying to figure out. And I'm not trying to exculpate.
I know.
I'm just saying that I think this sort of blanket of the news media completely screwed up is not.
I don't agree that.
Yeah, because I was in NPR's newsroom watching people trying very hard to figure out how to tell people when the president said something significant, point out when he lied, and not elevate his lies. But it is very hard to do when the president controls his own media outlets.
Okay, I'm going to ask John now, actually. John, do you think that virtually everything that a president tweets is news, and even something as possibly accidental? Covfefe, why was Covfefe such news?
Because it was really funny for like at least 10 minutes. I think like the fact of the president tweeting crazy stuff is news, right? But like the actual stuff is not necessarily news. And I think that's a kind of loophole that needed to be threaded better. It's interesting in these last few days since he got kicked off that it's almost like a counterfactual thought experiment playing out in real time. Like, what would the coverage be like if Trump didn't have Twitter?
What would Trump say in this matter?
Yeah, and I think like the conventional sort of narrative in media criticism circles has been that, there's been this frantic chasing of all of Trump's tweets, and it's totally kind of jerks everyone around. And I think that, you know, to a large extent that's true. But I also do think that the sort of tweets that would have driven like their own articles in every single news website in the sort of 2016-17 days were not by the end. But then you had this other weird problem of escalation, right? Where Trump would just do crazier stuff to get attention. So like, it would be like, okay, well, you don't care about me tweeting stupid typos anymore, so I'm going to call Joe Scarborough a murderer, and let's see if you pay attention to that. And it was like this kind of mutually assured destruction cycle that just kind of amped up the level of crazy. And I do think to a certain extent that, you know, it's hard to deal with that, because you're kind of damned if you do cover the lower grade stuff obsessively, and then damned if you don't, because he'll just do more stuff for attention. But I do think, you know, the fact that that works generally speaks to a model where he was always going to get attention, I think. And I think that's kind of what the last week has shown to me. I think if Twitter didn't exist, or if he didn't use it, he would have just found other ways to dominate the conversation. And I think you did start to see that towards the end, right? It would be, oh, I can't believe what Trump said on Fox today. Or I think there was one day where, I probably will get the details wrong, but there was a period where Twitter was sort of either taking down some of his really egregious lie tweets about the election, or like covering them up. And I think his campaign, or the White House, sent out like a tweet length missive on presidential headed notepaper to reporters, who then all duly tweeted it, being like, oh, look, Trump's doing this to try and get around the Twitter ban. Here's a screenshot of it. And then, of course, he gets around the Twitter ban because everyone has shared it. So, yeah, I think like obviously he's the subject of less attention now compared to when he was president, because he's not the president anymore. But I still think that he and the movement that he kind of energized or created, or however you want to describe it, are getting an absurd amount of attention, given, you know, relative to the actual power that they wield, both in Congress and in terms of the number of people in the country who voted for them. Like, I feel like you can't turn on the TV without hearing about Marjorie Taylor Greene at the moment. And in some ways, she's a very important story. I'm not saying she merits no coverage, but she seems to me to be a little bit like the next shiny object. So I think that the sort of period since Trump got kicked off Twitter has proved to some extent to me that he was always going to get that attention somehow. And there were certain particularly specifically corrosive things about the way he used Twitter, certainly. But, you know, I don't know if it was actually the determinative. I don't know if it was as much the medium as the message that was the determinative thing in the end.
Okay. Well, let's move on to Trump's re-election campaign. What did the White House press corps do effectively? And how could the news media have held Trump and the White House more accountable? And we did touch upon some of these in terms of picking and choosing, perhaps, which I realize it can be hard when your editor over your shoulder is saying, the competitor just reported on this tweet that you didn't do. So I'll throw it out to any of you, how effective you thought the White House press corps was.
What is troubling about how the press coverage unfolded was that, you had different media universes going on, and, the world of cable news was covering him one way, the world of print newspapers was covering him another. We had stringent standards about how we were going to use the word lie, but eventually the things he was saying about the election were so obviously lies. Everybody's calling them lies, and then you have this whole alternative media structure that is constantly validating what he says and criticizing other media outlets if they feel that they've undercovered what the president is doing. So it was a very tough needle to thread for journalists who were constantly trying to point out the excesses of his administration, or the lies of his administration. It felt to me, by the time we got down to the election, that what he was doing was so obvious and so egregious that all news outlets had to do was tell people what he was doing, and you could see how he was failing to address the pandemic, how he was enabling these people underneath him to undermine the election integrity. It was so obvious by then. I agree, I think, with John in that, a lot of our bigger problems came when he was first elected and news media were first confronted with a chief executive who lied all the time and who used social media the way he did and was backed by Fox News and was indeed colluding with them, you know, making phone calls and talking to Sean Hannity about his policies, out of public sight. And we didn't know how to cover that stuff. By the time we got to the end of his administration, I think most mainstream news outlets were doing a better job trying to keep up with this toxic train of craziness that was the Trump administration.
Yeah, I
I
think
thought it was,
part of the-
oh, sorry,
ahead.
go ahead.
No, so you go.
I was just going to say, I think part of the challenge for the White House press corps, who was working under incredibly difficult circumstances, was that, you know, he was a president who, if you didn't sort of do things a certain way, you were going to lose your access. And several reporters.
That's what I was
had
going to
fight.
raise. The precious White House press credentials.
And again, I think we have to be very clear about the financial calculations of media organizations, right? And even to reporters, like, you don't want to lose your press. This is your job, and you're covering the most maybe interesting president of all time, right? You're on the air every single day with some, you know, often insane, crazy, nutty story. So I think that while the White House press corps was working under difficult circumstances, I think they frequently made some big errors in how they thought about the coverage. So, and again, I'll generalize because obviously not every single person did this. I think our political coverage is a game. It's a football game, right? And it's all around characters and who's got the ball and who's, you know, and it's not, it doesn't actually center the people who are affected. It centers these big characters, bold face names. I find that incredibly disappointing. We like to talk about things like norms and the Hatch Act, but we don't spend a ton of time, I think, explaining, norm is a terrible word. Like, it's not a TV word. If somebody put norm in a script, I'd be like, no, norm is not a word anybody should ever have in a script. I found there was a book that came out by one of the White House correspondents that was called Front Row at the Trump Show. And it was so disappointing to me because I actually felt like, imagine calling your own job the Trump Show. Like, that's actually sad that you have this amazingly incredible job and opportunity. I mean, one of the most enviable positions in all of media, and you yourself call it that you have the front row at the Trump Show. That's a way of internalizing, right? The way that I think President Trump liked to think about his administration, that this is a show and you are players in it. And again, I'll point out Chris Cillizza at CNN, because I would comment on him a lot, often would talk about, you know, if they were Game of Thrones characters and this is a reality show and the president's reality show strategy. So all of those things to me were disgusting because they minimize the damage that was actually happening to actual people. Many of those people happen to be ethnic or racial minorities, right? So there are a whole bunch of people who didn't find any of it funny at all, that they didn't care about the palace intrigue and all of these things that tended to take over a lot of the reporting, that they wanted to have context. But I found you had some people who were very, had access, and they were going to pay off that access by who they interviewed and how they frame stories. And you could read it very easily in a lot of these stories. I say this understanding.
Although, same for other beats and other presidents as well.
Yeah, true. But I think in this case, Trump was so much like, I don't know of a lot of other presidents historically who, if you wrote a negative article, they would weed you out
personally
and
call you and berate you in your news organization. Right.
And they take you off the
I mean, I gotta say though, I mean, when you look at Yamisi Alcindor at PBS NewsHour, when you look at Jim Sciutto at CNN, some of the reporters who had the most visibility during the Trump administration were people who got in his face, he didn't like, and they even tried to yank Jim's press credentials. I think this situation is more complex. There were a lot of journalists who realized that the access they were getting to these people in the White House didn't count for as much because they either didn't know what was happening or they were lying. So I think CNN prospered, in fact, by making itself the opposition channel. they were constantly in Trump's face. And they would get called out at his rallies. And then you have to wonder, like, are you keeping an eye on what you should be doing as a journalist when your sort of brand as a news outlet is that we're the opposition to this craziness that's happening in the White House? I just think there were a lot of people who were kind of the exception to that.
Lots of exceptions.
And that's what made it so complex. There were some people who were who were doing what you said, but there were other high-profile people who were not.
But I would just jump in and just add to that, though, even as CNN is the opposition, right? Which, by the way, trust me, is a valuable position. I think you would agree with that, right? It's a marketable position. We are the opposition to Trump. They also were literally putting on the payroll people who were literally at the same time working for Donald Trump, right? So you could argue actually what they were doing was playing both sides. And you could say, how are you having on someone who's going to defend Donald Trump, who literally is getting paid and has a non-disparagement clause? I mean, and he's, the person I'm thinking of is not the only one. So I think it is more complicated. And clearly, I want to make sure that as we on this panel have this conversation, I'm going to speak in some generalities and things that I've seen. And there are lots of exceptions and some amazing reporting. I actually thought the reporting on the Trump administration from outside the White House correspondence was often excellent and had tons and tons of investigation and time spent really digging into data and paperwork. And I just thought there are just many examples of that were excellent. I think a lot of people within the White House had to rely on their sources within the White House. And I think there was, I'm sure there's always a quid pro quo. I think in this case, it was a very extreme case of it.
Okay, so along this vein, given Trump's bad behavior and the echo chamber by many of his close advisors, was the press able to interview these guests effectively without spreading disinformation? And I'm going to throw this to Eric. I saw a recent Twitter exchange where journalists copied you and others saying that nearly all journalists are now in the business of opinion. And your reply in part was, news audiences don't want journalists to pretend that they don't have opinions about obvious matters, just to be fair and transparent. So, Eric.
Well, again, I think we have to be careful about generalizing across media platforms because cable TV news has found that the way to success is by opinion and conflict, and that's across the board. Regardless of the ideological focus of the channel. So on CNN, you have Chris Cuomo, you have Don Lemon, you have even Jake Tapper. You have people who, years ago would have been labeled more straight news anchors. Anderson Cooper. They're all delivering opinions while they're also hosting shows that are supposed to be news or news analysis shows. And it happens across the board because that's one way in which you keep people watching cable TV news. If all you do is report the news, the minute you start to report on a story that people are interested in, they'll change the channel. But if you're delivering opinions and people are tuning in to see, well, what is Anderson Cooper going to say about, or what is Don Lemon going to say about, or what is Joy Reid going to say about, that holds people's attention and keeps them focused on the channel more. So I think more of that is happening in cable TV news because it's obvious that program strategy is working. Is that happening, at NPR? Is that happening on the PBS NewsHour? Is that happening in newspapers? Not so much. Not so much. And so I think we gotta be careful about tarring everybody with the same brush. Now, what I was also trying to point out was that I do think that people are aware that if you're an expert and you've been covering something for a long time, if you've been a political reporter for a long time, and you've been covering the White House for a couple of years, you got opinions about what's happening there, and any human would. And the question is, can you be fair? And the question is, can you use your opinions and your expertise to help the audience better understand what's going on and what may happen? And it can't just be an ideological opinion that you're delivering or something that sort of gets people's attention because it's so provocative. you can use your opinions to improve your coverage. And that's the thing that I'm concerned about, people, getting so upset about opinionating that they lose sight of the fact that people develop expertise in beats, and they should be allowed to leverage that expertise to make their coverage better.
Okay. During the elections, going back. The reality is there was a lot of news in 2020, aside from the election. Millions of Americans infected with COVID, hundreds of thousands dead. The pandemic forced a lot of people, including journalists, to work remotely from home. What gaps in election story coverage did you notice? John, do you want to jump in here?
Yeah, I can do. I wrote a couple of times last year about the phenomenon of there just being too much news generally. There was just an insane amount of stuff all happening at the same time, and all of the stuff kind of triggered more stuff, and it became this cascade of really important stories, and it was just impossible to focus on all of them. And I think media critics tend to have two types of complaint, right? Like, you're not focusing on this enough, or you're focusing too much on this, and you logically cannot focus on everything to a sufficient degree that's important in the world, and particularly in 2020. That said, I mean, there were obvious things that we know are generally very much undercovered that were still undercovered last year. Climate change being a great example of something that really should have played a huge part in election coverage and didn't. Otherwise, I actually think that, the pandemic, and I think there was someone crunched some numbers to this effect and kind of proved that it was true, at least on TV news, that like the sheer amount of election coverage in the earlier part of the election cycle going into the fall was like way down on previous election years because the pandemic had eaten up so much attention. And so the pandemic actually kind of did, sort of shunt the election off the front page or the top of the hour or whatever, at least for a period of time, which was, I think, a good thing because it deserved more urgent attention than everyone kind of recycling the same horse race talking points about something that's still a few months away. I think when the election got closer, what I noticed, in addition to there being gaps in the coverage, was kind of a disconnect between different parts of the coverage. So there'd be some really good reporting on just how crazy Trump's election lies were, and just how plausible it seemed that he would actually try after the election, depending on the circumstances of the result, to subvert it, right? There were some really detailed stories in The Atlantic and a couple of other places, and there was a Times opinion column to this effect too, which were like deeply sourced. It wasn't speculative, it was like sourced journalism about the future, saying this is what the Republicans are planning to do, here are the kind of constitutional and institutional levers they will pull to steal the election. And you have those people interviewed on cable news who wrote those stories, and that was good, basically. But then you would cut to another segment and it would be just focused on who is going to win this state. And it would all be kind of on the assumption that the track is even, that the playing field is even, and this is a normal election between two normal candidates. And I think that there was failure to kind of punch through that wall between understanding that this is not a normal election and it can't be because of these threats. There's really, I mean, the result obviously does matter. And in the end, I think it is completely true to say that the scale of Biden's victory was probably the key factor in stopping Trump pulling off an actual coup. If he'd won very narrowly in one state, you might be sitting here, under the second Trump administration right now. But, at the same time, clearly it was mitigated by this enormous con. And I think that the different kind of parts of the election coverage felt siloed from each other to me. And I think if the kind of urgency had run through the whole lot of coverage across every outlet, that would have maybe prepared us better for what happened in the aftermath of the election.
Yeah, and I agree that there was some fantastic coverage, despite people being isolated, despite not being able to reach some of the traditional sources, speaking with Main Street people in person to try to connect, other than people who might be reaching out to you. But how do we deal with that, despite the fact that there was some fantastic story coverage, that large swaths were just not seen by the American public, in part to help in their decision making if they were at that point of trying to figure out who they might actually vote for?
Yeah, I don't know how you solve that. I mean, that really is a distribution question, and also I think a little bit a conversation about how do you make sure that you're not running through a news cycle so quickly that a story that is so important and interesting and has incredible research behind it just doesn't get lost. I mean, the joke on Twitter, right, all the time was always, oh my gosh, doesn't it feel like it's only been 3 days since this massive story broke and everybody's moved on. One story that I think we missed that keeps popping up, right, was the number, for years, national security organizations have said that white supremacy is on the rise, hate speech is on the rise, violence through hate is on the rise, and that some of these people have infiltrated law enforcement organizations, right? And I've seen those reports over the last 10 years. And I feel like, and they all came to a head not too
That
long
was
ago.
January 6th, right?
But and we haven't really seen a connecting of those dots. And in fact, a lot of the people who cover the White House went, I thought I would lose my mind in exasperation when they would say, I can't believe I'm watching this unfold. And I'm like, literally, the insurrectionists have T-shirts that have been printed with the date. Like, this is your job to cover this, and other people, I knew about it. It's certainly not my job. I don't cover the White House. I don't cover Congress. I don't cover DC. And I understand that some people were just shocked, but other people were like, if you continue with hate speech, we know where it ends. We know where it lands. I was not surprised that people were encouraged and took that encouragement to go ahead and storm the Capitol. I was not surprised. So I think that it's a little bit about that. Like, how do you make sure that some of those stories that are so important are having the dots connected and don't just live like these individual little moments that if they don't get enough traction, they just sort of disappear. But if I could just add one thing Eric said that we just have to really underscore, it's so important when we talk about opinion or objectivity. The idea of being fair and transparent is everything. I just don't know of people who literally, I'd be worried if a reporter came into a story and had no opinion at all, like zero, not even one that they didn't want to share, but just like none. That would be bizarre. And so I do think we need to move that conversation, right, to being objective and fair and transparent in your coverage versus pretending that you don't have an opinion at all. I think that's just not true. And I think viewers actually recognize that as kind of bull.
Yeah. And I think what really bothers me is that we have so many people who don't follow the rules of ethics for people who disseminate opinion. There are rules of ethics for those of us who express our opinions. But when you have people like Sean Hannity and Tucker Carlson and Laura Ingraham out there, not being fair, not being transparent, not being accurate, and not being held to any sort of standard for that by their employer, it muddies everyone's idea of it creates this idea that if you express an opinion, then you have to express it the way they express it, in a way that is ideologically focused, ideologically biased, and that is, in many ways unethical. You're just trying to win an argument for your side, and you don't care how you do it. But that's not how ethical opinionators should work. And you can look at, the great work of columnists like, Charles Blow, or, even our own Sam Sanders at NPR, who wrote a great column about how we've ignored race for too long in the issues that led to the Capitol attack. And you can see people who express opinion in an ethical way, in a way where they leverage, their knowledge and their expertise, but they do it in a fair way, and they're transparent even while they're expressing opinions. And what's interesting to me, like, we can see how journalists' strategies in covering things have changed. If you look at the New York Times, when they first got all of this financial information on Donald Trump, short of his tax returns, they spent a lot of time. They created this huge project, and they kind of dumped it on the world, and it vanished in 3 days. I was surprised at how little people were talking about that story, like 3 or 4 days after it was published, even though they had created a component that was a documentary that ran on Showtime, and it was a massive project. When they actually got his tax returns and they did something similar, they parceled out the revelations every 2 or 3 days they would drop another huge story that had a bunch of revelations in it. And they made sure that their work stayed in the news cycle in a way that people could really see, okay, this is a subject that we should be paying attention to. And it kept people talking about his tax returns for at least like a week or two. And so I think some of what we saw was journalists trying to figure out how to adopt new strategies to deal with our shortened attention spans, the fact that there's so much news coming at them, and the fact that there's so many different platforms and different strategies for gaining audience that you all have to, try to sort through when you're trying to make an impact in the way that we're talking about.
And I would only add to that opinion, and I'll speak about cable news, is cheap, cheap, cheap. It's cheap. It's a money saver. It costs you nothing. The way it works is everybody is assigned to a contract. A contract can run, I'm sure some people are very expensive, but $100,000, $60,000 for some people for a year-long deal, which means you show up on TV, a certain number of appearances are guaranteed, right? And what that means is that they can just roll from one show to another. If you look at a lot of these shows, there's no actual content. There's just people talking. It's so incredibly cheap. And so when you ask people to rethink this strategy of two former congressmen debating each other, or two failed whatevers debating each other, it's just so inexpensive that it's hard to, I think, make people feel good about saying, no, what we should do is a really thoughtful, contextual, long piece where we send 2 crews, 3 crews into the field for a week and a half. Like, insane. That is so much money. I run a production company now, so I can tell you it is so much money. That's just not going to happen. Nobody in their right mind is going to take a look at the budget and say, let's get rid of Rick Santorum. They're going to say, you know what, we need more Rick Santorum, because the $100,000, I'm making that up, I have no idea what he gets paid. That's a sunk cost, right? So, I'm sure, but that's a sunk cost. And now we can just use them as much as we possibly can. That is hugely problematic in how information is being disseminated, certainly on cable TV news.
Okay, moving along. During the elections, why did news coverage not adequately anticipate and measure the concerns of the Latinx community, some parts of the Black and Asian communities, and particularly when there were some fairly progressive Democratic policies? And I think it goes back to the underreported stories, some in-depth stories that just were not seen by the broad population.
Let me tell you how most people do their political coverage on election night, right? They say, and now a look at the Hispanic vote. We've invited Maria Elena and Jose and Julian to come in and talk to us. And after about 4.5 to 6 minutes, depending on how big your window is to fill, you say, thank you so much. So interesting. We appreciate you joining us. And they leave. They're not woven into the fabric of the conversation of the electorate. And that is always the way. And it has to end. And I think it will end as the Latinx vote continues to surprise people, and people begin to realize that the Latinx vote is a complicated thing and they may not have the handle on it that they think. So yeah, I think it's a lot of gatekeepers. Gatekeepers often think of, and I think the New York Times is terrible at this. They like to do the Trump voter. They continue to do the Trump voter. Trump's not even elected anymore, and they're doing the Trump voter still. Much more than they do the Biden voter, much more than they do the voter who didn't, show up for the last 20 elections. Maybe that's too many. The last 3 elections, something dramatic, and now has decided to vote. Like, why did that person come out? There are so many interesting stories, but they love to constantly come back to the Trump voter. I think that is a mistake, but I think you center white people a lot. And when you have organizations that are run by white people, often middle-aged white dudes, they center white people. They sometimes cannot even help it. They sort of feel like, this is my point of view. It has to be the right point of view. I feel this way about it. I have covered a lot of stories about race in my career, and the conversations I've had around them would, surprise you. So I think that's a lot of the answer, that people just think of it as an add-on, as a random thing. And as the power of that electorate grows, then you're going to see, I think, some changes, hopefully. And the more diverse newsrooms get, I think you'll see the same.
I think there's also an element of monitoring by traditional media of different avenues, local language publications and broadcasts, and really getting into what are these minority groups thinking and feeling. I had long discussions with my mother when she initially said she was not voting for any president because she knew Trump, but she had also, through Chinese media, heard negative things about Biden, which was another just disinformation campaign.
Yeah, I think one reason why some Democrats may have been surprised by what happened to Biden in Florida is because they didn't understand how Cuban politics work in South Florida, and they weren't hooked into the Spanish language media down there, where talk radio is hugely influential amongst the people who vote. And there was a real turn towards Trump that I think kind of took Democrats by surprise. I think they thought the state would be a much closer run because of it. And Soledad talking about the stories where they focus on Latinos or they focus on Black people. It drives me crazy during presidential debates, where they will have the Hispanic anchor come out, and go, okay, now you get to ask the questions about Hispanic people. And then we'll go back to the regular questions that are, non-Hispanic anchors will ask, or they have the Black person show up and ask the Black people questions. As important as it is to have diversity amongst those panels of people who interrogate the candidates, and I'm sure those people of color want to ask questions that rooted in the issues that they care about in their culture and their community, I'm sure. But we got to take these issues out of the province of one person and spread them across the board and have all kinds of people asking all kinds of questions. I hate that here comes the Univision anchor or here comes the Telemundo anchor to ask a specific set of questions about a specific culture.
Although that question won't get asked, right? If they don't ask
yeah,
it,
if they don't do it, the
part of
question won't get
dilemma.
asked. But I'd love to hear the Telemundo anchor ask a question about, climate change.
Yeah,
or,
absolutely.
let's just free it up and have everybody learn about everybody's issues rather than, segregating issues to one type of person, especially during a debate. I just feel like those debates are a perfect reflection of what Soledad was talking about throughout the news process. It gets crystallized when we have those debates and we have those panels and journals.
Thank you. I'm sensitive to that question. Questions for us from the audience are pouring in, so I'm just going to move quickly to the last set question I have for now, which is with the Biden transition. There seems to be a palpable sigh of relief, especially on cable news, for a change in government and president, almost a fawning honeymoon period. I think some sympathies after January 6th as well. How does the news media hold Biden accountable? And I'm going to throw this to John, since I saw that recent column of his in Columbia Journalism Review. You wrote, "A press driven by outrage favors attention hijackers like Trump. How do we move on?" So, John, answer the question.
Yeah, well, maybe this is premature. I think the honeymoon period's over. I think it lasted like 2 days. I think it was basically like, oh, this is so normal. This is really normal. Did we mention how normal this is? Oh, it's so unifying. What a wonderful inauguration. This is really boring, actually. Let's go and talk to some crazy Republicans. Marjorie Taylor Greene, Marjorie Taylor Greene, Marjorie Taylor Greene, Marjorie Taylor Greene, and that's where we are. So I think people got bored like super quickly in a way that was bored and not charmingly bored, which is ridiculous. I think in terms of holding the Biden White House to account, I think there's like a middle line between two extremes that has to be walked, basically. On the one hand, trying to blow up everything they do and say into this kind of Trump level scandal, because under some misguided principle of, well, we treated the Trump White House this way, so we now have to treat the Biden White House with the same level of scrutiny. I think there was an editor at the New York Times who before Christmas tweeted something like, we will hold the Biden White House to account the same as we did the Trump one, which elicited a lot of pushback because they're not the same entity. So you need to avoid doing that. At the same time, though, I have to say, I think there have been some perfectly legitimate news stories I've seen about like potential corporate conflicts of interest around some of Biden's cabinet appointees. Not huge stories, but I don't think they've been hyped up as being huge stories. But they are, they're legitimate things for a press that can do many things at once to actually have someone on that to produce that journalism. And people on Twitter will shout it down as like, this is ridiculous, you're trying to like compare this to Trump, etc., etc. And I don't think that is right. And actually there is an enormous amount that is basically corrupt about American government and governance under, you know, both parties and all presidents, no matter how well-intentioned they might seem. And certainly a lot that is dysfunctional. And yeah, and I think that requires aggressive scrutiny. And if it took the Trump period to kind of lift a degree of complacency about that, then I think that's basically a good thing. But yes, clearly, like, we don't want 4 years of Hunter Biden stories as if he is, you know, on a par with Trump's kids. I would just also say that the thing that's really disappointing to me about this early coverage is it's so obsessed with unity, and treats unity as something that is exclusively Biden's responsibility, right? If he can't get these Republicans to agree with him, he has failed because he promised unity, which is completely unfair on him because I don't think he promised that he would do like everything bipartisan, or he wouldn't do it at all. I think it was an invitation to work on a bipartisan basis, not a kind of absolute, if we can't get Republicans, we won't do anything, number one. But number two, because the promise of Trump implicitly, if not explicitly, was I'm going to come and destroy everything. And that's exactly what he did. So it's not tenable to hold someone accountable for coming in and fixing everything when it is not in their power to fix everything. And I think it goes back to what Soledad said earlier, and I actually think that we've seen more of this politics as game framing in the first couple of weeks of the Biden administration than we saw in the last sort of 6 months of the Trump administration, frankly. Everything is about Senate procedure, everything is about bipartisanship. You have Chuck Todd and others on Sunday morning TV literally trying to like be the broker in negotiations between guests from the parties. Like, would you go down to $12 now minimum wage? Oh, well, you know, would you meet in the middle there? No, that's not your job. Your job is to ask how this would affect real people who are struggling enormously. It's not to kind of value bipartisanship as a solid kind of moral good in and of itself. And I think it's desperately, I'm not saying there is no coverage that doesn't fall into that trap, but I'm finding it desperately hard at the moment to find kind of top line coverage that is really anchored in what people need and not, you know, nonsense, frankly. And yeah, I guess I don't think it's been a particularly promising start.
I would say that one thing that kind of annoyed me was that there was a real impatience to considering what Biden was doing, given that he was inaugurated like on January 20th. I mean, it's like, you know, the guy hasn't been in office a month, and we're already trying to gauge how effective he's been as president. And
why has he not solved the coronavirus pandemic? Why?
Exactly.
Why? Tell me why.
Or yeah, so I think some of this stuff is kind of ridiculous, and that's you know, you talk about the Marjorie Taylor Greene coverage though, and what that signals to me is that news organizations realized that they missed something in this attack on the Capitol. They not only missed that these people would go this far. I mean, everybody knew they were going to gather where Trump was, and they were going to complain and have a raucous rally. I don't know how many people expected them to actually breach the Capitol with zip ties, looking around for legislators to take hostage. I was surprised by that. and so now that the news media has been surprised by how far these people will go, there is a real effort to identify how much support they have in Congress and who is going to enable what they're doing and who isn't. And she's the most visible example of that. She's also the most visible example of how the Republican Party is falling in step with QAnon and with Trump, rather than returning to a more traditional posture now that Trump is out of power. And so these questions are important. And so, you know, again, I gotta be careful about sort of dismissing every story about her or dismissing every story about political gamesmanship, because there are some important questions about what kind of Republican Party are we going to be dealing with? Is Trump still going to control it by remote? Is McConnell and more traditional elements going to be able to assert control? Are they going to be held hostage by the QAnon wing, who Marjorie Taylor Greene represents, is the most visible sort of representative of? And then, you know, what do Democrats do in response to that? And are they just going to are they going to sort of try to disregard the Republicans, or are they actually going to try to work with them? these are all questions that are really important, and exploring them requires some level of political gamesmanship type coverage that I think we just that is necessary.
Yeah, just quickly, I agree, and I don't think it's like an either or thing, like either it's completely saturated or there's no coverage. I think there's definitely, of course, there's room for coverage on the dynamics in the Senate, but I don't think it has to be every part of coverage, and I don't think it has to be the yardstick by which you judge whether the actual plan Biden has is good, right? Like it has to be judged by what it would do for people in the country. For me, it's the kind of moral framing of like the process actually becoming the end goal that I object to, not like how will this actually get the votes, which is clearly important. I think on Marjorie Taylor Greene, yeah, no, I agree with you to a certain extent. I think she's an important figure and merits quite a lot of coverage. But I think the coverage she's getting is way beyond that. It seems to be wall to wall. And then secondly, I think the problem is that there are two kind of types of Marjorie Taylor Greene coverage that I've observed. The one you describe, which is useful, is kind of using her to illustrate the problem in the Republican Party of radicalization, right? And like it's breaching into Congress. But the other type is kind of, at least implicitly, casting her as someone who is an outlier and someone who is a thorn in the side of the sensible Republicans who just want rid of her. And I think that is an incredibly dishonest, I mean, it might be what their sources are telling them, but it's a sort of morally dishonest rendering of what this Republican Party has done. And I think that's the coverage I have an issue with. What will Kevin McCarthy do about her? He's really annoyed with her. It's not credible. And we saw this the other day too, this Mitch McConnell statement. Oh, Mitch McConnell has slammed Marjorie Taylor Greene. Well, frankly, where was Mitch McConnell in November and December when Trump was telling the country that he won the election when he didn't, and McConnell could have shut it down? And he was silent for weeks and weeks and weeks and weeks and weeks. We need to get past this idea. And I'm sure you agree with this, Eric. It's not aimed at you, but we must get past this idea that the only people worthy of scrutiny in the Republican Party are Marjorie Taylor Greene, Ted Cruz, Josh Hawley. It is all of them, frankly, or very nearly all of them in positions of institutional responsibility who help get us to this point. And to the extent coverage of Marjorie Taylor Greene elucidates that dynamic, it's good, albeit maybe a little over the top. To the extent it obscures that dynamic, I think it's bad. And I think we're seeing, unfortunately, both of those things at the moment.
Okay, thank you. I'm now going to move to some questions from the audience, so maybe I'll read them and then try to go through as many as possible with one of you answering each one. So Soledad, question from Jennifer Posner, a fellow media critic. I've written about journalistic complicity in Trump's rise to power from 2015 on. I'm interested on your take on what news media should have done earlier on. For example, the media's refusal to clearly name Steve Bannon a white supremacist when he was running Trump's campaign, or Les Moonves saying that Trump wasn't good for America, but was damn good for CBS.
Yeah, I think a couple of things off the top of my head. It took a really, 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 really long time for media to call lies lies. They just really struggled with it. Things that were overt lies were like, yeah, but how do we really know someone's motivation? Well, we do. And when someone's lying, I think you can say they're lying. It took them a really long time, years, actually, too long. That was a huge, gigantic mistake. And they could have done that, and they chose not to. I think the media eventually came around to racially tinged became like, what is that even? Like, that's not even a thing. Racially tinged, it doesn't even make sense. But it was a good indication of how uncomfortable many journalists felt about, do I call somebody racist, or do I even say that they are saying things that are in fact racist? And so they'd use these words that allowed them to kind of have this cushion, right? Racially tinged, racial, using racial language. Those things are not actual things, right? So finally, I think people got around to calling somebody saying something racist, used words that are racist. And I those are two of probably the biggest examples that I saw that were real fails, that the media did self-correct, but it literally took years.
Okay. And Eric, question from Anthony Tellez. Recently, a New York Times freelance editor was fired over a tweet in which she wrote that she got, quote, chills seeing Joe Biden's plane arrive at Joint Base Andrews shortly before his inauguration. Do you think social media can be detrimental to journalists when they publicize their political leanings and show a bias?
I think news outlets are terrible at managing social media and the social media activities of their reporters. And I think I've led seminars on this, at the Point Institute and other places. And what I wind up telling journalists is the only real rule is do not embarrass your employer, because the minute you do that, they're going to find a way to get rid of you. and I, Lauren Wolf is who this person's talking about, and I've admired her work for a long time. I don't think the New York Times, part of the problem is that there's not a lot of transparency over what happened to her. The New York Times made some public statements where they tried to indicate that there was more to her firing than this one tweet, but they won't say what it is. Lauren seems convinced that it was the tweet that resulted in her dismissal. She wasn't officially a staffer, she was like a contract employee, is my understanding. So the rules are even more different. But the bottom line is that news outlets are very inconsistent. Administrators are very inconsistent in how they apply standards to how their employees use social media, and it's it's conditional on how big a star the employee is who does it, whether or not that use embarrasses the news organization or not, and how the top manager feels about it. Marty Baron at the Washington Post typically had a very sort of traditional view about reporters expressing their opinions on social media that would be a little different than maybe the editor of, say, the Chicago Tribune or the Los Angeles Times. So I've always been critical of news organizations and their inconsistent ways of applying rules about using social media. And I think, unfortunately, Lauren got caught up in that hypocrisy and inconsistency. And I hope at least that the New York Times learned a lesson about firing somebody or discontinuing working with somebody over something like that.
Thank you. And move on to John. There's a question from Karen Mumford. The Trump White House didn't hold press briefings with the media very frequently. Now that the Biden administration is holding daily press briefings, what are your thoughts about journalists having to send questions in advance?
Yeah, I saw this story in the Daily Beast, and we actually discussed this at CJR today a little bit. I think it's a little complicated, and it kind of depends on why they are why they're asking to see these in advance, right? Clearly, if they're asking to see the questions in advance so they can not pick that person because it's hard, or they can make up some spin in the interim, then that's a problem. But if, as the White House has claimed, the reason they would like to kind of get a sense of the questions in advance is so they can come into the briefing room adequately prepared to actually answer questions, then I don't necessarily have a problem with that. Clearly, it should not be a condition of your attendance that you give the question in advance, right? But if a reporter who has a relationship with the White House press secretary is asked, what question are you going to ask today, and they decline to say, and that's fine, and they turn up and they get to ask that question regardless. But if they trust the White House press secretary to actually kind of try and go away in good faith and get an answer for them, they sort of give them an idea. I think that can be fine. That can be fine as well. And I think that piece from the Daily Beast did also point out, which is important, that Jen Psaki has called on every reporter in the room at every one of her briefings. So there isn't really evidence that she's avoiding people. And I think I think I saw some tweets to this effect, but I think it kind of comes down to what you want the White House press briefing to be, right? If you want it to be this kind of dramatic spectacle where you own the White House press secretary and make them stutter like a fool, and you can play that clip on your air and at the top of every hour, then you're not going to want to give them the question in advance. But if you see it as something that should not be the center of attention, but is just kind of a low-key opportunity to scrutinize, but also to get actual information that you need, then I think that's okay. And I think there's a degree of hypocrisy in some of the criticism of this, given that I feel like Jen Psaki was being criticized last week for saying, "I'll get back to you" too much, and now she seems to be trying to be more prepared going in. And you can't have it both ways, right? You want her to be prepared, or you want her to be unprepared, but you have to kind of acknowledge that she will maybe not be able to answer every question. So I don't know her, I don't have a relationship with her, but I would feel like if White House reporters think this is an honest request being made in good faith, I wouldn't see like an ethical red line against it, in my opinion. But clearly, if it's being abused, or if it becomes access becomes conditional on supplying this information in advance, then clearly that is a problem. Yes.
And we have a question directed specifically for Soledad. It's from
Uh-oh.
Jab Boothby. In addition to being a vocal critic of Brett Kavanaugh, you hosted a follow-up to the Surviving R. Kelly documentary series on Hallmark. As an advocate for victims of sexual assault, do you feel that the Democratic Party made a mistake in propping up Joe Biden after Tara Reade's allegation came to light? And do you believe that major news organizations were wrong to deny Ms. Reade an earlier opportunities to speak up?
I did not do any reporting on Tara Reade, so I probably am not a great person to answer this question because I won't give you the depth of an answer that you want. But by my recollection, Tara Reade was very problematic and it was proven over time. So I think the short answer is no.
Okay, fair enough. Moving on to Eric, as much as this is from Katidiato Diara, as many as journalists and news organizations like to say they are unbiased, there was a clear divide in the public opinion of the 2020 elections. What was the stand of your networks and outlets, and how do you think it was perceived?
I've always said that I think the focus on political bias that people have regarding mainstream news organizations is a little misplaced because there's so many things that news outlets are biased towards, mainstream news outlets are biased towards, that are not political, that affect their coverage a lot more. They're biased towards making money. They're biased towards celebrity. They're biased towards conflict. They're biased towards what's considered. They're biased towards white culture. I mean, there's so many biases that come into play when you look at what some news organizations do, and I'm talking about mainstream news organizations, that trying to reduce that to left-wing bias, I think, is simplistic and misses the mark. Now, there are news outlets out there, or there are media outlets out there that call themselves news outlets that are definitively biased towards certain ideologies. And Fox News Channel is a political operation disguised as a news channel, as a cable news channel. And the mask has fallen off of that channel a long time ago, but particularly in the last few years of the Trump administration, it was obvious. When your biggest star is regularly having phone conversations with the president once his show's over to help him influence policy, to help him figure out policy, you've lost the ability to claim that you're an independent news outlet. So do we want to talk about media outlets that are specifically and overtly biased towards one politician or one administration or one political outlook? Or, do we want to take a look at how mainstream media works and decode all the different biases that are affecting what you see? I just think this, judging mainstream media through this political bias lens is simplistic, and you miss a lot. But there is a whole alternative media structure that is oriented towards right-wing conservative ideology that also should be looked at very carefully.
Okay. And the last question from the audience, I'll ask John to answer. It's from Baruch journalism professor Emily Johnson. A lot of people misunderstand or mischaracterize what freedom of speech actually means in the United States. Do you have any thoughts on the frequency with which many people have bemoaned the loss of free speech as private companies have cracked down on information? What role has the press played in that narrative, and what role should it play going forward?
Yeah, I basically, like, my rule of thumb on this is that, like, by and large, there are very few like actual free speech libertarians, and most people just like their speech and speech they agree with and hate the speech of people they don't agree with, and they're being dishonest if they tell you otherwise. Obviously, yeah, the sort of the right-wing media sphere, which Eric has brought up multiple times and I haven't brought up nearly enough so far, is hugely invested in this preposterous cancel culture narrative, right? Which the existence of the programming about it clearly disproves the actual premise of the segment. otherwise, I think that, yes, I think that there is an oversimplification of the idea of free speech in the kind of reality-based media as well. Just among kind of reality-based people in general. Obviously, I think as you may have been referring to in the question, this misunderstanding that people have First Amendment rights on privately owned social media platforms, which they do not. I think what we need to do better is to kind of reconceptualize freedom of speech, to the extent we're not doing it already, as a power dynamic, right? It seems very much that the narratives are focused on very simplistic things like Trump having his Twitter taken away. Or I think, you know, the example which I actually wrote about at the time was when he did that Facebook post and tweet saying, when the looting starts, the shooting starts, right, in the summer. And the sort of, even among the reality-based press, the lens was like, have Facebook, you know, done the right, is it not newsworthy that he's tweeted this and he's the president, you know, doesn't he have a kind of a right to a megaphone on that page? You know, isn't it a threat to freedom of speech to shut him down? But there's no real consideration for the fact that he was using his speech to try and shut down the speech of other people, or at least threaten to. Similarly, you know, I'm much less interested in Trump's freedom of speech on Twitter, given that he is an immensely powerful man with any number of other ways of getting his speech across, than I am in the speech of the tens of, you know, millions and millions of voters whose vote, let alone speech, Trump supporters tried to definitively and violently cancel on January the 6th and for the many weeks preceding it. So I think we have to get to a more nuanced understanding where we see that speech is a trade-off. Like I don't think we should ever take lightly decisions to deplatform people, because, you know, even if they have objectionable views, I do think there are people in the press, maybe on the progressive side of the media sphere, who can be, I think, quite flippant about the possible consequences of that. And I think the press should generally operate from a principle of, like, we should have a robust and free exchange of ideas. But given the media structure is so immense, the media sphere, is so immensely kind of structured by money and power, sort of having this simplistic definition of your speech is not free if you've been removed from Twitter, even if you're you know, a millionaire or the president or whatever, is not the type of speech I think we should be most concerned about, I guess.
No, this has been a wonderful discussion, and I could listen to this all night. And I want to apologize there are literally dozens and dozens of questions stacked up that we're not going to get to. But I want to thank our panelists and moderator Betty Wong for a wonderful discussion. I think this is such an important issue. The motto of the Washington Post is "Democracy dies in darkness." And I think we need to look to journalists to shine the light. And I think there's a lot of great journalism out there, and I'm encouraged by that. And there are a lot of problems that all of you have noted that we hope are addressed. I want to just give a shout out to Linda Haley, who is the events manager, marketing director for the Weissman School at Baruch, whose team has made this happen. And a special thank you to my colleague, Gisele Regetau, who has labored hard with me to pull this whole panel together. So thank you all very much. It's really been a terrific discussion.